Imagine dropping beneath the surface of a calm Greek bay and finding yourself standing on a street. Not rubble, not scattered stones. A street, straight-edged, deliberately laid, wide enough for two people to walk side by side, stretching away from you through clear, shallow water. On either side, walls rise from the seabed. Doorways open into roofless rooms. Courtyards sit exactly where someone planned them thousands of years ago. And just ahead, the stone-lined curve of a harbour still holds its shape, as though the boats simply haven't arrived yet. All of it sits just 3 to 4 metres below the surface, close enough that sunlight reaches the paving stones, close enough that you could almost touch the past with an outstretched hand. That place is real. It lies in Vatica Bay, off the southern coast of Laconia in the Peloponnese, and it is called Pavlopetri. It is, by current reckoning, the oldest known submerged town on Earth, a Bronze Age port city that was functioning, trading and growing when the great civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean were just beginning to take shape. Its streets are 5 metres wide. Its buildings number at least 15 from the original surveys, and recent work suggests there may be far more still hidden beneath the sediment. Roughly 30,000 square metres of mapped structures lie waiting in water shallow enough to wade in, yet this city remained largely unknown to the modern world until the late 20th century, and some of its deepest secrets are still being uncovered. Here's what makes Pavlopetri genuinely strange. No one left a record of what happened to it. No ancient historian described a city sinking beneath the waves off southern Greece. No inscription mourns its loss. No legend clearly points to this bay and says, here is where a great port once stood. A civilization built roads and harbour walls and storage buildings and tombs, conducted commerce with distant islands, and then, at some point, by some combination of forces, it went under water, and the written world simply moved on without noting it. Scholars today believe a series of earthquakes and a long, slow rise in sea level gradually swallowed the settlement, but the precise timing and the exact sequence of events are still debated. Was it a sudden catastrophe or a slow abandonment? Did people watch their streets flood and leave? Did the harbour keep functioning even as the lower buildings went under? The geology suggests one set of answers, the archaeology suggests others, and they don't always agree. That uncertainty matters, because Pavlopetri is not an isolated mystery. It belongs to a much larger and still unresolved puzzle about what the ancient Mediterranean coastline actually looked like, and how much of it is now underwater. Sea levels around the world have risen significantly since the Bronze Age, and the coasts that ancient sailors knew, the harbours where they loaded cargo and sheltered from storms, the towns that grew up at the water's edge, are not where they used to be. Some were buried by volcanic eruptions, the way Akrotiri on Santorini was sealed under ash and pumice, preserved almost perfectly. Others, like the Neolithic coastal settlement of Atlit Yam off the coast of Israel, simply drowned as the shoreline retreated. Pavlopetri is part of that same story, a Bronze Age harbour city that the sea reclaimed, leaving its bones intact in shallow water while history forgot it existed. It is the kind of discovery that quietly reshapes what we think we know about early urban life, early trade and early seafaring in the ancient world. And it is the kind of discovery that, for obvious reasons, has also attracted comparisons to Atlantis, though the reality, as you will see, is far more interesting than any myth. What this video is going to do is take you through all of it. We will start with where Pavlopetri lies, and why that particular stretch of coastline created the conditions for both a thriving port and its eventual disappearance. We will follow the story of how it was first sighted and then rediscovered, twice, nearly a century apart. We will look at what the streets and buildings and harbour structures actually reveal about the people who built them, how they lived, what they traded, and how sophisticated their urban planning really was. We will examine the competing theories about why and how the city went under. And we will look at what happened when researchers finally brought 21st century technology to bear on the site, mapping the entire settlement in 3 dimensions for the first time and uncovering buildings and streets that no one even knew were there. And through all of that, one question will keep surfacing. How is the harbour still standing? After 5,000 years of submergence, earthquakes, and the slow grind of the sea, the stone-lined harbour of a Bronze Age port city sits largely intact on the floor of a Greek bay. That fact alone says something remarkable, not just about how it was built, but about what we might still be able to learn from it, if we can protect it long enough to keep asking the questions. The bay where Pavlopetri rests is not a dramatic place to look at from the surface. Vatica Bay sits at the very bottom of the Peloponnese, tucked into the southern edge of Laconia, a region that even in antiquity was considered remote, the kind of coastline that belonged to fishermen and sailors rather than to great capital cities. The mainland shore here is called the Pounta Coast, a low-lying stretch where the land meets the water without ceremony, and just offshore lies a small, unremarkable islet that shares the site's modern name. Between that islet and the mainland, a narrow channel opens into shallow, clear water, and it is in that channel and the sandy bay beyond it that the drowned city lies. To look at it today, even from a boat, you might see nothing unusual. The water is calm here most of the time, and in good light it runs a particular shade of turquoise green that you find throughout the Greek Aegean. But lean over the side and look down, or drop beneath the surface with a mask and snorkel, and the picture changes entirely. The bottom is not bare sand. It is a city. Walls run in straight lines. Doorways face onto open spaces that were once courtyards. Streets extend into the blue distance with a deliberateness that nature simply does not produce. And all of it sits in just 3 to 4 meters of water, roughly 10 to 13 feet, which means that on a bright day, full sunlight reaches the paving stones, casting shadows into doorways and along the faces of walls that have not seen the open air in thousands of years. That shallow depth is one of the most striking things about Pavlopetri, and it is not just a curiosity. It is genuinely unusual for a Bronze Age site of this age and completeness. Most submerged prehistoric settlements around the Mediterranean lie at depths that require scuba equipment at minimum, and often specialist diving gear or remotely operated vehicles to reach properly. The deeper a site lies, the darker and colder the water, the more sediment accumulates, and the more difficult sustained archaeological work becomes. Pavlopetri sits close enough to the surface that early researchers could survey portions of it by snorkeling. That accessibility has been both a gift and a problem, and we will come back to the problem in due course. The geography that shaped Pavlopetri's position was not accidental from a Bronze Age perspective. It was practically ideal. The narrow channel between the islet and the Pounta Coast acts as a natural funnel, creating a sheltered, sandy anchorage that would have been exactly what Bronze Age seafarers needed. The vessels that crossed the Aegean during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE were not large by modern standards. They were shallow drafted oar and sail-driven boats that needed calm water to load and unload cargo, protection from open sea swells, and a sandy or gravelly bottom where they could be beached safely. Vatica Bay provided all of that. The islet itself forms a natural breakwater, blocking swell from the south and west, and the channel between it and the mainland is narrow enough to offer protection, without being so tight as to make navigation difficult. Position also mattered in the broader maritime geography of the Bronze Age Aegean. Pavlopetri sits at a point on the Peloponnese coast that places it naturally between the Greek mainland to the north and the island of Crete to the south, with the island of Elaphonisos lying just nearby. For Bronze Age sailors following the coastline south from the Peloponnese toward Crete, or heading north from Crete toward the Greek mainland, this bay was a logical waypoint, close enough to landmark features for navigation, sheltered enough for overnight anchorage, and positioned at a junction where different sea routes converged. That kind of geographic advantage tends, over time, to attract people, trade, and infrastructure. A natural harbour becomes a seasonal stop becomes a permanent settlement, and a permanent settlement in the right location becomes something larger. What the archaeology at Pavlopetri suggests is that this particular bay became something considerably larger than a waypoint. The preservation of the city's remains is a product of several overlapping factors, and understanding them helps explain why Pavlopetri looks the way it does, and why it is also in danger. This site has never re-emerged from the water. Once it went under, it stayed under, which meant it escaped the kind of disturbance that destroys ancient remains on land. Later, agricultural ploughing, construction, quarrying for building materials, and the long, slow damage of human occupation on top of older occupation. The stone walls of Pavlopetri have not been pulled apart to build medieval houses or Ottoman farmsteads. They have simply sat on the seabed, under a few metres of water, undisturbed in that particular way. There is also a protective ridge of rock that runs along one side of the site, shielding portions of it from the stronger currents and erosion that would otherwise break down exposed masonry over millennia. That geological feature, modest as it sounds, has made a real difference to how much of the original architecture is still readable. Combined with the relatively calm conditions in the sheltered bay, it has allowed walls to remain standing and street surfaces to remain largely intact, rather than being scattered across the seabed. But shallow water cuts both ways. The same accessibility that allows sunlight to reach the streets also means that boat anchors reach them too. Sediment in shallow water is more easily disturbed, and the bay sees regular boat traffic. Modern runoff and pollution affect the site in ways that deeper, more isolated underwater sites are spared. The exposure that makes Pavlopetri visible also makes it vulnerable, and that tension runs through everything that has happened at the site since its rediscovery. As for the scale of what lies here, the honest answer is that we are still finding out. The original surveys conducted in the late 1960s identified a built-up core of structures, streets, buildings, courtyards and tombs, covering roughly 30,000 square metres. That figure was already remarkable. But when researchers returned with advanced survey equipment between 2009 and 2013, they uncovered an additional 9,000 square metres of previously unmapped buildings and streets, including a large hall roughly 40 metres long that had gone entirely unnoticed in earlier work. That expansion alone suggests that the full extent of the settlement has been consistently underestimated. Some estimates now place the total footprint of the town at around 100,000 square metres, roughly 10 hectares, though a large portion of that area remains buried under accumulated sand and sediment. What that means in practical terms is that only a fraction of what was once Pavlopetri has been fully examined, and the boundaries of the settlement have not yet been definitively established. The city could be considerably larger than what has so far been mapped. It could contain structures and spaces that would change the interpretation of the entire site. We genuinely do not know, because the sand has not yet given up everything it holds. That uncertainty is important to sit with for a moment. When we talk about Pavlopetri as the world's oldest known submerged town, we're talking about a site whose full dimensions are still unclear, whose occupation history spans a range that different scholars place differently, and whose relationship to the wider Bronze Age world is still being pieced together artifact by artifact, wall by wall, survey season by survey season. The confidence with which the site is sometimes described, a complete Bronze Age town, perfectly preserved, just sitting there, is not wrong exactly, but it is a simplification. What is actually there is something more interesting. A significant portion of a major Bronze Age settlement, preserved well enough to be studied seriously, but still containing genuine unknowns about its extent, its history, and the lives of the people who built it. What can be said with confidence is that whoever chose this spot chose well. The channel between the islet and the Punta coast gave them exactly the kind of sheltered anchorage that Bronze Age maritime commerce required. The position on the southern edge of the Peloponnese placed them at a natural crossroads of Aegean sea traffic, and the slow rise of the water over the millennia since the settlement was abandoned has, paradoxically, helped preserve what they left behind, sealing it in shallow water, away from most of the forces that erase ancient places on land, while keeping it close enough to the surface that the light still reaches the stones. The question of how it was first found, or rather found twice nearly a century apart, is where the story gets properly complicated. The first person to notice that something was wrong with the seabed at Vatica Bay was not an archaeologist. He was a geologist, and what he saw in 1904 he recorded in French, a brief technical note that used the phrase vestiges antiques submergés, submerged ancient remains. His name was Phocion Negris, and he described a series of stone walls visible beneath the water off the Laconian coast. That was essentially the whole of it. No systematic mapping, no dimensions, no attempt to trace the extent of the structures or understand what they represented. The note mentioned that walls were there. It offered nothing about their scale, their arrangement, or their state of preservation. And then, for more than 60 years, it sat in the record like a footnote to a book nobody was reading. There are reasons why Negris's observation did not become a breakthrough. In 1904, underwater archaeology barely existed as a discipline. The tools that would eventually make submerged sites accessible to serious scientific investigation, waterproof cameras, scuba equipment, survey instruments usable on the seabed, were either primitive or not yet invented. A geologist noting submerged walls while studying coastlines was doing exactly what a geologist in his era might reasonably do, making an observation and recording it in terms appropriate to his field. What Negris almost certainly did not have the framework to recognise was that what he was looking at might be an organised Bronze Age settlement, rather than a collection of random ancient rubble. The emerging field of Aegean archaeology at that time was focused overwhelmingly on sites like Mycenae and Knossos, grand palaces and rich tombs that could be excavated on dry land and fitted into a heroic narrative of the ancient world. A vague notation of submerged stones on a quiet bay in southern Laconia was not going to redirect that attention. So the find faded. The walls that Negris had seen kept sitting on the seabed, undisturbed by investigators, occasionally passed over by fishing boats. The water above them was warm in summer and quiet in winter. The stones went nowhere. The decades accumulated. The man who changed that was Nicholas Fleming, a marine geologist working at the Institute of Oceanography. In 1967, Fleming was engaged in something broader and more systematic than treasure hunting. He was conducting a scientific study of relative sea level change around the Mediterranean coastline. This involved looking specifically at submerged ancient structures, harbour walls, coastal buildings, quaysides, anything that had once been above water but was now below it, as evidence for how much sea levels had shifted over time. It was exactly the kind of scientific context in which a report of submerged walls in a Laconian bay would be worth following up, because to Fleming, those walls were not an obstacle or a curiosity, they were data. When Fleming came to Vatica Bay and put his face in the water, what he saw was something that went far beyond what Negris had noted 63 years earlier. This was not a few scattered wall fragments. There was an organised layout here, a pattern in the stones that spoke not of random debris or a collapsed structure at the water's edge, but of something far more deliberate and extensive. Streets, wall alignments that ran parallel and perpendicular to one another, open spaces that were clearly too regular to be natural. The clarity of the water helped. In good light, the shallow seabed revealed itself with unusual precision, and what it revealed was plainly the skeleton of a settlement. Fleming recognised the significance immediately, and his recognition had a decisive consequence. The following year, 1968, the Cambridge Underwater Exploration Group mounted the first dedicated archaeological survey of the site. The explicit aim, stated at the outset, was rigorous and ambitious: to survey the visible remains and produce a plan of a prehistoric town. This was not treasure hunting, not speculation, and not a reconnaissance dive. It was a properly organised archaeological expedition, and it treated Pavlopetri from the beginning as what it actually was, an ancient urban site that deserved to be mapped with the same care and attention that any significant land site would receive. What the 1968 survey recorded was striking. Streets ran in recognizable alignments across the seabed. Wall foundations defined the outlines of individual buildings, and those buildings were arranged in ways that spoke of planning: shared walls, adjacent courtyards, doorways that opened onto thoroughfares. Rock-cut tombs were identified, suggesting not just habitation, but a community with organized mortuary practices, a society that had lived here long enough and in sufficient numbers to develop the kind of burial customs associated with settled, permanent occupation. The survey work continued into 1969, building a more detailed picture of the site's structure and extent. What became clear very quickly was that Pavlopetri was not what underwater discoveries along ancient coastlines typically turned out to be. The usual finds in the Aegean, amphora scatters, anchor stones, the occasional wooden keel, are the remnants of ships and their cargoes. Shipwrecks are immensely valuable to archaeology, but they tell a particular kind of story: the story of a vessel, its route, its goods, and the moment of its loss. Pavlopetri was telling a completely different story. There was no ship here. What was on the seabed was urban infrastructure, the physical bones of a community that had organized space, constructed buildings, laid out streets, and buried its dead according to established practice. The distinction is not a subtle one. A shipwreck is a snapshot of a moment. A town plan is a record of centuries. It is worth being honest about what those early surveys could and could not establish. The technology available in 1968 was capable enough to identify the presence and rough alignment of major structural features, but the precision of the recording was limited. Later, high-resolution sonar work conducted between 2009 and 2013 would dramatically expand the mapped area of the site, discovering thousands of additional square meters of buildings and streets that the earlier surveys had entirely missed, including a haul of 40 meters that nobody in the 1960s had detected. So the picture that Fleming and the Cambridge group produced was real and important, but it was also, by later standards, incomplete. They saw enough to understand that something extraordinary was here. They did not yet see all of it. The early chronological interpretations were also subsequently revised. The first surveys identified the site as broadly Mycenaean in character, fitting it into the period running roughly from 1600 to 1100 BCE. That seemed significant enough. A Mycenaean port town was already a remarkable find. But later ceramic analysis pushed the evidence for occupation considerably further back, to around 3500 BCE, or possibly earlier, suggesting that people had been living, trading and building here for a span of time that dwarfed what the initial assessments had implied. What Fleming had found was not just a Mycenaean settlement. It was a site whose roots reached back into the early Bronze Age and perhaps beyond, a place with a history measured not in centuries but in millennia. None of that was fully understood in 1968. What was understood by everyone who saw the survey results was that a submerged prehistoric town had been found in the Aegean, that it was organized and extensive, and that it was sitting intact on the seabed of a quiet bay in southern Greece, waiting to be understood. When the Cambridge team finished their first surveys and began the work of interpretation, the most natural frame of reference was the Mycenaean world. The pottery they recovered, the architectural forms they could identify, the general character of the settlement as it appeared in the late 1960s, all of it pointed toward the late Bronze Age, toward the civilization that had built Mycenaean triremes, that had traded across the Aegean, and possibly inspired the siege narratives that eventually became the Iliad. On that basis, Pavlopetri was assigned a primary date range of roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. The site was described as a Mycenaean port town, and that description was not wrong, but it would turn out to be significantly incomplete. The Mycenaean dating made intuitive sense given what was visible: the architectural layouts, the tomb types, the ceramic assemblage that could be readily identified in those early investigations. These all had recognizable Mycenaean parallels, and the Mycenaean period itself was already well understood as a time of substantial maritime activity in the Aegean, a world of palace economies that organised agricultural surplus, manufactured goods, and long-distance trade into networks stretching from mainland Greece to Crete, Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt. A port settlement on the Laconian coast fitted that picture naturally. It had the right location for a trading hub, the right kind of structures for a working maritime community, and the right period for the kind of commercial activity that Bronze Age scholars had spent decades reconstructing from palace archives and shipwreck cargoes. But pottery does not lie about its own age, and as ceramic analysis became more systematic and more detailed, a different picture began to emerge. Among the sherds recovered from Pavlopetri were pieces that did not belong to the Mycenaean horizon at all. They were older, significantly older, and their typology pointed toward a period that archaeologists classify as the final Neolithic, placing their manufacture at around 3500 BCE. That is not a minor chronological adjustment. Between 1600 BCE and 3500 BCE lies roughly 1900 years, more time than separates the Roman Empire from the present day. The discovery of final Neolithic ceramics at Pavlopetri did not simply push the site's date back a little. It transformed the question of what Pavlopetri actually was. Further analysis added more texture to that picture. Alongside the Neolithic material, the ceramic record showed a substantial early Bronze Age component, representing occupation somewhere in the range of 3000 to 2000 BCE. What this meant, taken together, was that the sequence at Pavlopetri was not a single phase of use followed by abandonment. It was a layered record of continuous or repeatedly renewed occupation spanning something in the order of 2000 years before the Mycenaean period even began. The site's history was not a chapter. It was an entire volume. The 2009 to 2013 underwater survey, which brought more sophisticated analytical tools to bear on the site than any previous investigation, reinforced this expanded chronology. The presence of late Neolithic pottery was confirmed, and the survey team's assessment placed the earliest phase of occupation at approximately 5,000 years ago, which, counting back from the present, aligns with the late 4th millennium BCE. This was not a Mycenaean town that happened to have a few older sherds scattered in its fill. It was a settlement with roots in a period that predates the construction of Stonehenge, a community that had established itself on this stretch of Laconian coastline when the Aegean world was still organised around village societies rather than palace states. Here it is worth being honest about where genuine scholarly uncertainty lies, because sources do not all agree on how to weight these findings, and the disagreement is not simply a matter of one side being right and the other wrong. Part of the difficulty is methodological. Underwater stratigraphy is considerably harder to resolve than stratigraphy on dry land. Water movement, biological activity, and sediment disturbance can all mix ceramic material from different periods in ways that make it difficult to establish clean stratigraphic sequences. When a sherd from 3500 BCE appears at a submerged site, the honest question is not just when it was made, but whether it was deposited in an undisturbed context that confirms continuous occupation, or whether it arrived at its final resting place through processes more complicated than simple accumulation. These are not reasons to dismiss the Neolithic dating, but they are reasons to speak carefully about what the evidence conclusively establishes versus what it strongly suggests. The other source of disagreement is interpretive rather than purely methodological. Different scholars have different reasons to emphasize different phases of the site's history, and those emphases lead to genuinely different characterizations of what Pavlopetri is. If your primary interest is in Mycenaean civilization, its trade networks, its urban forms, its place in the broader late Bronze Age world, then the Mycenaean phase of Pavlopetri is its most meaningful period, the time when the settlement appears to have reached its greatest intensity of use and its most elaborate physical form. The late Mycenaean occupation, particularly the phase running roughly from 1300 to 1100 BCE, left the most visible structural traces, the most abundant ceramic evidence, and the clearest signs of organised maritime commerce. For scholars working within that framework, Pavlopetri is essentially a Mycenaean port city that happens to have some earlier material in its record. But if your interest is in the longer question of how coastal communities developed and persisted in the Aegean across deep time, the story looks quite different. From that perspective, what is most remarkable about Pavlopetri is not any single phase, but the continuity itself, the fact that human beings found this location useful enough, safe enough, and resource-rich enough to return to it and build upon it across multiple distinct periods of Bronze Age culture. A settlement that was occupied during the final Neolithic, maintained through the early Bronze Age, and then reached its urban peak during the Mycenaean period, is not simply a Mycenaean site with old pottery. It is evidence of a location that proved persistently attractive to maritime communities across a span of roughly 2,000 years, which raises questions not just about Mycenaean trade, but about the deeper environmental and geographic logic that made certain coastal locations repeatedly viable as settlement sites. The honest answer to the question of how old Pavlopetri really is may be that the question itself is slightly too simple. The city that appears most clearly in the archaeological record, the one with the recognisable streets and the stone-lined harbour, and the architectural complexity that makes it look, to modern eyes, like an actual town, is broadly Mycenaean in its most visible phase. But the community that eventually produced that town had been establishing itself and rebuilding itself on the same stretch of Laconian coast since people were making pottery in the final Neolithic. What lies on the seabed at Vatica Bay is not merely the remains of a single Bronze Age city. It is the accumulated record of a coastline that mattered to people for an extraordinarily long time, an understanding that distinction changes what we think we are looking at when we look down through the clear water at those ancient walls. What makes Pavlopetri so difficult to fully absorb, even after you understand the chronology, even after you have accepted that something genuinely ancient lies on that seabed, is the sheer completeness of what is there. Most Bronze Age sites come to us in pieces. A wall foundation here, a scatter of sherds there, a tomb cut into a hillside empty by centuries of looting, or simply by the slow dissolution of everything organic that once gave it meaning. Archaeologists working on land are accustomed to reconstructing ancient life from fragments, to taking a corner of a building and inferring a floor plan, to reading a handful of potsherds as the ghost of an entire economic system. The interpretive skill that defines the discipline is precisely the skill of filling vast absences with disciplined imagination. Pavlopetri does not require that skill in the same way, or rather it requires it less, because what is visible on the seabed is not a fragment, it is a plan. Streets are still there, not the idea of streets, not the theoretical reconstruction of where streets might have run based on the alignment of wall stubs. Actual streets, defined by standing stonework on both sides, running in recognisable patterns across the floor of Vatica Bay. Houses line those streets in rows. The houses are not single-room shelters, but substantial structures, some with as many as 12 rooms, organised around recognisable domestic logics, spaces for sleeping, for storage, for the daily work of a household. More than 15 residential buildings have been identified and mapped, and those are only the structures that have been fully documented so far. The settlement covers a known area of around 30,000 square metres, and surveys conducted between 2009 and 2013 uncovered an additional 9,000 square metres of structures that had not previously been recorded. Estimates of the total urban footprint now range well beyond 2 hectares, with some assessments suggesting the full extent of the settlement may have been considerably larger, potentially exceeding 8 hectares, though that larger figure remains a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion rather than settled fact. Behind the houses, courtyards open up. These were not decorative spaces. They were working parts of the domestic economy, places where cloth could be dried after weaving, where animals might be penned, where the outdoor tasks of a coastal household could be organised away from the street. The presence of these courtyards matters because it tells us something specific about how the people of Pavlopetri understood the relationship between interior and exterior space, between private and semi-public life. This is not the spatial logic of a temporary camp or a purely functional trading post. It is the spatial logic of people who intended to stay, who had opinions about where certain activities should happen, and built their environment accordingly. Beyond the residential core, a cemetery sits just outside the built-up area. Rock-cut graves and cist tombs have been identified, organised in a pattern that reflects deliberate decisions about the relationship between the living city and its dead. Inside the settlement itself, additional tombs have been found, suggesting that the boundary between domestic and funerary space was not always absolute, that in some cases the dead were kept close to the households they had belonged to. This is a detail that no amount of fragmentary wall foundations could tell you. It requires preservation at the level Pavlopetri offers, where the spatial relationships between structures have survived intact enough to be read as a social document. What archaeologists recognized when they began systematically analyzing the layout was not a random scattering of ruins, but a planned settlement. The streets follow a broadly regular orientation. House footprints repeat in ways that suggest not improvised construction, but something closer to a building tradition, a community-wide understanding of how domestic structures should be organized. Water management channels have been traced connecting residential areas to the harbour zone, implying that the people who built this city were thinking about infrastructure in a coordinated way, that freshwater, drainage and maritime access were understood as problems to be solved together rather than separately. This is urban planning in a genuine sense, not in the anachronistic sense of imagining Bronze Age bureaucrats with blueprints, but in the functional sense of a community that made systematic decisions about how their built environment should work. That recognition, that Pavlopetri represents planned urban space rather than organic accumulation, is what separates it from almost everything else archaeologists have to work with from the same period. The Bronze Age world produced sophisticated civilizations, as the palace sites at Mycenae and Tiryns and Knossos all demonstrate, but those sites have been reoccupied, built over, excavated down through, and reconstructed across millennia of subsequent use. What survives is usually the most durable and the most monumental. The thick circuit walls, the deep storage magazines, the burial shafts that were cut deep enough to survive later building activity, the everyday fabric of Bronze Age urban life, the houses and streets and courtyards where most people actually spent most of their time, has been overwhelmingly lost. Pavlopetri preserves that fabric. It preserves it because it was submerged around 1000 BCE, through a process that involved seismic activity and gradual sea level rise, though the precise mechanism and timing remain subjects of active research. And because once submerged, it was never built over, never quarried for convenient cut stone, never reorganized to suit the needs of a later population. The city that went under the water is, in its essential structure, the city that is still there. It is a frozen moment in a way that very few archaeological sites anywhere in the world can claim to be. And crucially, the domestic spaces and the maritime spaces are frozen together. This is the quality that gives Pavlopetri its particular value as a window into Bronze Age coastal life. You can walk or swim from a residential courtyard to the harbour zone in a matter of metres, and both spaces are legible, both are preserved, and the relationship between them is visible in a way that it simply is not at any comparable site. The storage vessels, the large pithoi that would have held grain and oil and wine, are concentrated near the harbour. The houses are behind them. The tombs are beyond the houses. This is not an abstract archaeological inference. It is a spatial sequence you can trace across the seabed, a direct material record of how trade, storage, domestic life, and the acknowledgement of death were organised in relation to each other in a working Bronze Age port. No other site currently known to archaeology offers this combination at this scale, with this degree of preservation. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is simply the situation that confronts anyone who tries to place Pavlopetri in comparative context. The closest parallels are all partial, sites that preserve some of what Pavlopetri preserves, but not all of it, and not in the same intact spatial relationships. What lies on the floor of Vatica Bay is, to the extent that the phrase means anything precise, the clearest view we currently have of what a Bronze Age coastal city actually looked like from the inside. Not as a monument, not as a palace, but as a place where people lived and worked and traded and buried their dead year after year for generations. Of everything that survives at Pavlopetri, the harbour commands a particular kind of attention, not because it is the most dramatic feature on the seabed, the streets and multi-room houses carry their own immediate power, but because of what its survival means against the backdrop of what has been lost almost everywhere else. Ancient ports are, as a rule, the least preserved component of ancient coastal life. The sea does not keep its margins well. Tidal action, wave energy, storm surges, biological erosion, and the relentless appetite of later builders for conveniently pre-cut stone have conspired across the millennia to dismantle most of what Bronze Age maritime communities built along their waterfronts. What typically survives of an ancient harbour is not a harbour at all. It is a suggestion, an isolated pier fragment here, a scatter of iron mooring rings there, a scatter of ballast stone that might once have formed a quay face, but which can no longer be read as a coherent structure. Against that background, the harbour at Pavlopetri is something genuinely different. It needs to be described carefully, because the word intact invites misunderstanding. No one is claiming that the harbour at Pavlopetri sits on the seabed in the same pristine condition it was in the day the city was last used. Individual stones have shifted. Surfaces are weathered. Sediment has accumulated in certain zones, obscuring details that further excavation may eventually reveal. What intact means in archaeological terms is not physical perfection. It means structural continuity, the condition in which the essential architectural logic of a structure remains recognizable and connected, so that the original form can be traced as a coherent whole rather than inferred from disconnected remnants. By that definition, Pavlopetri's harbour is intact. The stone revetments that line its edges survive as a continuous element. The quay walls are still there, still standing in structural relationship to each other, still enclosing the sheltered basin they were built to protect. The harbour's overall footprint, its shape, its orientation, its relationship to the settlement behind it, is legible in a way that cannot be said of virtually any other Bronze Age port currently known. The comparison with other sites makes the significance clearer. The Minoan quay remains at Cydonia are fragmentary, enough to confirm that a harbour existed, not enough to reconstruct how it worked. The Mycenaean dock evidence at Pylos has been substantially eroded, leaving archaeologists with partial traces and significant interpretive gaps. These are not failures of excavation or analysis. They reflect the simple physical reality that ancient harbour structures rarely survive in usable condition. The stone that built a Bronze Age quay was always going to be among the first things a later community reached for when it needed building material, and the portions that escaped reuse were generally left to the mercy of the sea. Pavlopetri's submergence, whatever its human cost, removed the harbour from that cycle of reuse and demolition. It went under the water and stayed there, undisturbed in its fundamental structure, while every comparable installation on the surviving coastline was being dismantled stone by stone. The layout of the harbour, now that it can be read as a coherent whole, tells a specific story about how the port was designed to function. The basin is a sheltered sandy inlet, protected by the stone revetments on its landward and lateral margins, a configuration that would have made it well suited to the beach landing ships that characterized Aegean maritime practice in the Bronze Age. These were vessels that needed to be pulled up onto shore, not moored alongside deep water quays in the style of a later Greek or Roman harbour. The shallow, sheltered basin and the firm, sandy bottom were not incidental features. They were the design. Someone, or more likely a succession of someones across multiple generations made deliberate decisions about how to shape this inlet to receive that kind of vessel safely. What was happening near that key line is visible too, and it points directly to the harbour's role as a working commercial infrastructure rather than simply a landing place. Concentrations of large storage vessels, the pithoi that appear throughout the site, cluster near the waterfront. These were not domestic storage containers in any ordinary sense. They were the industrial-scale containers of a redistributive economy, the vessels that held the olive oil, the wine, the dyed cloth, and the other commodities that moved through a Bronze Age trading port. Their concentration near the harbour indicates organised loading and unloading zones, specific areas on the quayside designated for the transfer of goods between ship and shore. This is not improvised commerce. It is port logistics, spatially organised and physically embedded in the structure of the harbour itself. The pithoi do not tell us every detail of how the operation worked, but they tell us it was an operation, that Pavlopetri's harbour was managing the flow of goods in a systematic way. The implications for how historians think about early port engineering are considerable, and they are still being absorbed. Before Pavlopetri's harbour could be properly studied, the earliest well-documented evidence for deliberately engineered quays and organised maritime infrastructure was associated with the more widely known palace-based civilizations of the later Bronze Age. The Mycenaean palaces at their height, the major Minoan centres at their peak. The assumption, largely by default, was that sophisticated harbour construction was a relatively late development within the Bronze Age sequence, emerging in connection with the political and economic machinery of the palace systems. Pavlopetri challenges that assumption directly. If the occupation of the site extends back to around 3500 BCE, and the ceramic evidence suggests it does, even if the most intensive phases of use may have clustered in the Mycenaean period, between 1600 and 1100 BCE, then deliberately engineered harbour infrastructure was present at this location centuries earlier than the palace-based systems that were previously considered its context and precondition. That pushes back the timeline for organised coastal engineering in the Aegean in a way that reshapes the broader narrative. Sophisticated port construction was not something that had to wait for palace bureaucracies to organise it. Communities that never built a throne room were apparently capable of shaping their waterfronts with deliberate engineering logic, of constructing the stone revetments and quay walls that would manage coastal traffic for generations. The harbour at Pavlopetri is evidence that this capacity existed much earlier and was much more widely distributed across Bronze Age Aegean society than the surviving record had previously suggested. The harbour still stands, in the sense that matters archaeologically. Its walls are still connected, its basin is still defined. The spatial relationship between its quay line and the storage zones behind it is still visible on the seabed. That survival, improbable as it is given everything that typically happens to ancient harbour structures, is what makes it possible to ask, and in some cases to begin answering, questions about Bronze Age maritime engineering that the fragmentary record at every other comparable site has never permitted. The harbour then gives you the infrastructure. What spreads out behind it gives you the lives. Step back from the quay line and move inland through the submerged remains of Pavlopetri, and the picture that assembles itself is not what most people carry in their heads when they think about the Bronze Age. The mental image that classical education tends to produce, columned palaces, throne rooms, frescoed corridors, the administrative machinery of Mycenae or Knossos, bears almost no relationship to what the seabed here reveals. Pavlopetri was not a palace complex. It was a town. A working, inhabited, densely organised town, where ordinary families lived in houses with courtyards, ground grain, dried cloth, stored provisions, and made their way each day through a grid of well-built stone streets to the water and back. What survives here is something rarely recovered from the Bronze Age, a view from the ground floor of a society rather than from its ceremonial summit. The streets themselves establish the character of the place immediately. They are laid out on a grid, not perfectly geometric in the manner of a later Hellenistic city, but systematically enough to indicate deliberate planning, a prior decision about how movement through the settlement should be organized before the first house was built. Stone-lined and serviceable, they run between the residential blocks in a pattern that tells you people moved through this town according to established routes, that the settlement had a spatial logic its inhabitants understood and depended on. These were not paths that formed by the accumulated habit of foot traffic across open ground. They were built, maintained, and connected to a larger scheme. Off those streets, the houses open their plans to anyone willing to read the foundations carefully. The dwellings at Pavlopetri were built on stone foundations, substantial enough to survive 5,000 years of submergence, with upper walls probably of mud, brick, and timber that have not survived. The structures range in complexity, but the recurring form is a multi-room house organised around a courtyard. These courtyards appear to have been working spaces in the fullest sense, areas where grain was ground, where produce was dried, where the domestic activity that sustained a household unfolded in the open air rather than inside the relatively dim rooms behind the foundation walls. Private outdoor space integrated into the daily rhythm of a family's labour. Not a luxury feature, but a functional component of how a household in this climate and in this period organised its work. The organisation of those households implies something specific about the social structure of the settlement. These were family-scale dwellings, not the subdivided barracks of a slave economy, not the monumental halls of an elite compound, but houses built to the proportions and internal logic of family life. Multiple rooms allowing some separation of activity and perhaps of family members across generations. Courtyards that were private rather than communal, belonging to a specific household rather than to the neighbourhood as a whole. The architecture suggests a community of households operating with a degree of autonomy, each managing its own space and its own domestic economy within a shared urban framework. What the palatial sites of the Bronze Age reveal is the top of a social pyramid. What Pavlopetri reveals, with unusual directness, is the broad base, the kind of settled, organised, property-holding family life that formed the actual fabric of Bronze Age society across most of its geographical spread. The evidence for domestic production is scattered across the seabed and concentrated in ways that are telling once you know what to look for. Loom weights, small perforated stones used to tension the vertical threads of an upright loom, have been recovered from the site in numbers that indicate textile production was not incidental to life here but central to it. Weaving was household work in the Bronze Age, overwhelmingly performed within domestic contexts, and the presence of loom weights in residential structures connects the physical remains of those structures directly to one of the most economically significant activities a family could undertake. Cloth was not merely clothing, it was a trade commodity, a store of value, a medium of exchange. The households of Pavlopetri were not simply consuming the goods that passed through their harbour. They were producing goods that entered that same trading network, contributing the output of their domestic looms to the commercial flows that gave the port its economic purpose. Storage connects the domestic and the commercial in ways the pithoi make concrete. These large ceramic storage jars, some of them substantial enough to hold hundreds of litres, appear across the site in concentrations that cluster around specific buildings. Some clustering near the waterfront has already been noted in the context of the harbour's loading and unloading zones. But pithoi also appear deeper in the residential fabric of the town, associated with individual houses rather than with the harbour infrastructure specifically. The contents varied: olive oil, wine, dyes, grain, and other commodities in different combinations depending on the household's activities, but the pattern of storage speaks consistently to a community managing surplus, accumulating goods above immediate daily need, and participating in a redistributive economy in which households were active nodes rather than passive recipients. Storage at this scale implies planning, implies the expectation of future exchange, implies economic actors thinking beyond the present meal. The movement of goods through and beyond the settlement is visible not only in the Pithoi but in the landscape connecting the waterfront to the wide world. On the mainland shore nearby, cart track incisions have been cut into the rock, the physical trace of wheeled vehicles making regular journeys along a fixed route between the harbour and inland supply sources or markets. These are not accidental marks. They are the consequence of repeated heavy use of the same path over an extended period, the kind of wear that accumulates only when a route is an established part of an economic system. Goods came down to the harbour along those tracks and went back up along them. The port was not a self-contained bubble of maritime activity. It was a node in a supply chain that reached inland as well as outward across the water. What Pavlopetri offers, taken as a whole, is something that the record of Bronze Age civilization has always lacked in abundance, a picture of how the majority of people in a sophisticated maritime society actually lived, not in the palace, not in the throne room, on a stone-paved street, in a multi-room house with a working courtyard, grinding grain in the morning and carrying cloth to the harbour in the afternoon, storing oil in a sithos by the back wall, and listening to the sound of the next vessel coming in from the Aegean. The rhythms of labour, trade and family life that sustain the Bronze Age world were being lived out here, in ordinary houses on ordinary streets, in a town too busy being functional to leave much room for ceremony. That picture has survived against considerable odds because the sea took it before anyone else could take it apart. The town was busy. That much the seabed establishes without ambiguity. But the more specific question, busy doing what, with whom, and across what distances, is where Pavlopetri begins to reshape what we thought we understood about Bronze Age commerce. The Pithoi are the most immediate evidence. Hundreds of them lie distributed across the site, and while some cluster in domestic contexts as already described, others concentrate in a pattern that belongs to a different order of economic activity altogether. Around certain buildings near the harbour front, the density of large storage jars points towards something beyond household provisioning. These are warehousing arrangements, organised accumulations of commodities at the interface between the sea lanes and the land, positioned precisely where you would position them if your purpose was to receive goods arriving by ship, hold them against the right moment or the right buyer, and dispatch them again when the conditions were favourable. Olive oil, wine, dyes, luxury items. The range of goods a pithos could hold maps almost perfectly onto the range of commodities that move between Aegean centres in the Middle and Late Bronze Age. The concentration of these vessels around specific buildings suggests something that resembles, at its structural logic, a redistribution depot, a place where the flow of goods was not merely passing through, but being actively managed. No inscribed accounting records have been recovered from Pavlopetri. The linear B tablets that survive from Mycenae and Pylos give us the bureaucratic machinery of palace economies in extraordinary detail, but Pavlopetri has yielded no such documents, and the interpretation of what the Pithoi contained and who controlled them rests on the spatial pattern of the finds rather than on written evidence. That caveat matters, and scholars have been careful about it. What the archaeology can demonstrate is organisation, the deliberate arrangement of storage capacity at scale, without being able to fully reconstruct the administrative system that operated it. The economy implied by the physical remains was sophisticated. The precise mechanisms of that sophistication remain partially opaque. The loom weights extend the picture in a different direction. Already noted in the context of domestic production, they deserve a second framing here at the level of the wider trading economy. Textile production in the Bronze Age Aegean was not merely a domestic convenience. It was one of the primary drivers of long-distance exchange. Cloth, particular kinds of cloth, in particular qualities and quantities, was a traded commodity that moved across the same sea lanes as oil and wine, that commanded value at every port where a ship put in, and that figured prominently in the redistributive economies of the palace centres. The concentration of loom weights at Pavlopetri indicates that the town was not simply a waypoint on someone else's trading route, it was a producer. The households behind the harbour were generating textile output that entered the Aegean exchange network, contributing to the commercial flows that gave the harbour its reason for existing. A port that imports and exports, rather than merely handling the goods of others, occupies a different and more active position in a trading system. Pavlopetri appears to have been that kind of place. The imported ceramics make the external connections explicit. Among the vessels recovered from the site are pieces originating from Minoan Crete, high-status forms, in some cases imitated by local potters who were apparently familiar enough with Minoan shapes to copy them in their own clay. This is not the kind of evidence that accumulates through casual or accidental contact. It speaks to regular direct engagement with the Minoan world, ships crossing from Crete to the southern Laconian coast, or Pavlopetrian vessels making the return passage. The Minoan civilization at its peak represented the most sophisticated maritime commercial culture in the Aegean. To find its ceramic fingerprints at Pavlopetri is to find Pavlopetri positioned within the highest order exchange network of its era. It was not a peripheral settlement on the edges of Bronze Age civilization. It was participating in the same circuits of exchange that connected Crete to the Cyclades to the Greek mainland, and the mainland to the broader eastern Mediterranean trading world. The chronological span of the material culture makes this even more striking. The occupation of Pavlopetri, as best as the ceramic evidence allows scholars to determine, and the precise phasing remains debated, runs from the final Neolithic period around 3500 BCE through the Middle Bronze Age and into the Mycenaean period ending around 1100 BCE. That is a span of engagement with the sea and with neighbouring Aegean cultures that stretches across millennia, not centuries. The town was not a brief commercial experiment that rose and collapsed with a single trading cycle. It was a persistent node in the network, adapting through successive cultural phases: Neolithic, Early Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age, Mycenaean, while maintaining its fundamental character as a port. The exchange networks it participated in evolved around it. The dominant powers shifted, the ceramic fashions changed, but the harbour kept operating and the pithoi kept filling. This was mature, long-established maritime commerce, not its tentative beginning. What the physical layout of the harbour reinforces is the organisational intelligence behind that commerce. The stone-lined quay was not an improvised structure. It was planned infrastructure, built to accommodate vessels and to facilitate the movement of goods across the waterline efficiently. Around it, the concentration of storage capacity in identifiable warehouse-like buildings created a port district in the full functional sense, a zone dedicated to the economic activities that gave the settlement its regional importance. Producers came from inland along the cart tracks cut into the rock on the nearby shore. Merchants arrived by sea. Between them, the port mediated, receiving, storing, redistributing, dispatching. The model is not significantly different from what you would find in a functioning medieval harbour or in a small modern port economy. It is recognisably commercial in its spatial logic, recognisably organised in its infrastructure, recognisably integrated into a network of supply, demand and transport. This is what makes Pavlopetri so important as a piece of evidence, and why it matters that the harbour has survived structurally intact. The classical Greek world is often treated as the beginning of sophisticated Western commercial and urban life, with everything before it either primitive by comparison or known only through palace archives that emphasize elite redistribution rather than market exchange. Pavlopetri quietly undermines that framing. Here, centuries before the classical polis, before the Athenian agora, before the commercial networks that would eventually connect Greece to Phoenicia and Egypt and the Black Sea coasts, a working port was mediating between inland producers and seafaring merchants, managing surplus, importing luxury goods from Crete, and exporting the output of its own workshops across the Aegean. The infrastructure was in place. The commercial logic was operational. The networks were functioning. The classical world did not invent maritime commerce. It inherited it, from places exactly like this one, now lying 3 meters beneath the surface of the water off the southern coast of the Peloponnese, still waiting to give up the rest of what it knows. What the harbour implies about trade, the streets confirm about everything else. Pavlopetri was not a scatter of buildings that happened to accumulate near a convenient anchorage. It was a designed place, and the more carefully archaeologists have mapped its layout, the more that design reveals itself as the product of deliberate, coordinated thinking about how a community should be organised in space. The street network is where this becomes undeniable. The roads that run through the submerged town are not the irregular, opportunistic paths that form when people simply walk the same way often enough to wear a route into the ground. They are straight. They run for dozens of metres without deviation. They are built from stone, bounded and maintained, with a regularity that speaks to a plan existing before construction began rather than emerging gradually from habit. This is an orthogonal grid, the same organising principle that architects and urban planners would later apply to the classical Greek world's most deliberately conceived cities. At Pavlopetri, it appears centuries earlier, laid out by people who understood that a settlement functions better when movement through it is predictable, when access to different parts of the town is guaranteed rather than negotiated, when the street does not belong to the nearest householder, but to the community that depends on it. Along these streets, the buildings arrange themselves in clusters. Houses sit alongside one another, detached in some cases, sharing walls in others, grouped around courtyards that provided light, ventilation, and shared working space. The pattern is familiar to anyone who has studied the residential quarters of later Mediterranean cities. It represents a solution to the problem of dense settlement, a way of organising the competing demands of private domestic life and communal proximity. What makes Pavlopetri notable is not just that this solution appears here, but how early it appears and how completely thought through it seems. The clustering is not random. Buildings are positioned in relation to the streets and to each other in ways that suggest access was planned, that the movement of people and goods from the harbour through the residential quarters and out toward the surrounding landscape was considered when the layout was established, not patched together after the fact. The water management is perhaps the most quietly impressive aspect of the planning. Stone-lined channels ran through the settlement, directing rainwater and surface runoff away from the buildings and toward the harbour, guttering, cut and placed deliberately, controlled where water went rather than leaving it to find its own path through the streets and courtyards. This is not the kind of infrastructure that appears accidentally. It requires an understanding of drainage gradients, a willingness to invest labour in infrastructure that benefits the collective rather than any individual household, and a social mechanism for deciding that such investment will happen and ensuring that it does. At Pavlopetri, the drainage system speaks to a community that was thinking not just about individual buildings, but about the town as a functioning whole, about what happens when it rains, about standing water in narrow streets, about the runoff reaching the harbour without undermining the foundations of the buildings along the way. The waterfront orientation of the streets reinforces the integrated logic of the plan. Roads lead directly to the harbour. The connection between the residential and productive parts of the settlement and its economic interface with the sea is not incidental. It is built in, literally paved into the design. The placement of storage vessels in identifiable zones near the water's edge suggests that the movement of goods was also anticipated in the layout, that certain areas were designated for loading and unloading, that the flow of commodities from ship to storage to distribution followed routes that the street grid itself helped define. The town, in other words, was planned around its function, and its primary function was maritime commerce. Then there is the large hall. Among the structures mapped during the 2009 survey campaign, a rectangular building approximately 40 metres in length stands apart from the domestic clusters by its scale. A structure of that size does not fit comfortably into any model of purely private use. 40 metres is a significant investment of construction effort. The building's dimensions place it in a different category from the houses around it. What it was used for remains uncertain. The archaeology of Bronze Age communal architecture is rarely definitive about function. But the possibilities that a structure of this kind typically invites include assembly space, administrative coordination, communal storage, or some combination of civic purposes that required a building larger than any private household would need. Whether it represents an administrative centre, a meeting hall, a large warehouse serving collective economic purposes, or something else entirely, its presence indicates that Pavlopetri's planners were designing for social functions beyond the domestic. There was provision here for activities that belonged to the community as a whole. This is the point at which Pavlopetri most directly challenges the standard picture of early urbanism in the Aegean. When most people imagine a Bronze Age city in this part of the world, they imagine something palace-centric, a monumental royal or administrative complex sitting at the heart of the settlement, with everything else organised in relation to it. Mycenae had its citadel, Tiryns had its walls and throne room, Knossos had its labyrinthine palace at the centre of Minoan civilization. The palace economy model has dominated thinking about Bronze Age Aegean society for generations, and with good reason. The surviving evidence from the major palace sites is both abundant and spectacular, but Pavlopetri does not fit that model. There is no citadel here, no palace, no dominant royal complex that organises the surrounding settlement around itself. What there is instead is a street grid, residential clusters, drainage infrastructure, harbour access, and a large communal hall. This is a suburban, trade-oriented urbanism, built not around a ruler's residence but around the practical requirements of a community engaged in production, storage, and maritime exchange. The scale of what has been mapped makes this significant beyond the local. The core survey area covers roughly 30,000 square metres, and the expanded mapping added another 9,000. Estimates of the full settlement extent range considerably. Some modelling suggests the town may have spread across as much as 8 hectares, though the total area remains debated and future survey work may revise those figures in either direction. What is not in doubt is that this was a substantial settlement by any Bronze Age standard, and that its organisation reflects a level of urban planning sophistication that historians and archaeologists had not expected to find predating the classical polis by anything like the margin Pavlopetri suggests. The history of urbanism in the prehistoric Mediterranean needs to make room for what this town represents. Organised street grids, drainage systems, designated commercial zones, communal structures, and waterfront integrated planning. These were not inventions of the classical world. They were inherited by it. Pavlopetri offers the physical evidence of that inheritance, not in archives or later accounts, but in stone, still roughly where it was laid, beneath 3 meters of water, off a shoreline that most people drive past without knowing what lies just offshore. So the city was real, it was substantial, and it was organised with a sophistication that continues to surprise. The question that follows almost immediately is the one that haunts every drowned place. Why is it underwater? The answer, it turns out, is not a single event. It is a layered problem, and the more carefully researchers have examined it, the more clearly it resists the kind of clean, dramatic explanation that makes for a satisfying story. The leading explanation centres on earthquakes. The southern Peloponnese sits in one of the most seismically active corridors in Europe, where the African plate pushes against the Eurasian plate and the accumulated stress releases along a network of faults that runs through Laconia and out beneath the sea. This region has produced major earthquakes throughout recorded history, and the evidence from Pavlopetri suggests it was doing so in prehistory as well. The prevailing model identifies the first major seismic event at roughly 1000 BCE, around the end of the Bronze Age, as a critical threshold moment, a point at which shaking severe enough to lower the land surface brought parts of the settlement into or very close to the sea. But the research does not stop at one earthquake. Current thinking suggests that 2, 3, possibly 4 additional shocks followed in subsequent centuries, each one delivering another downward jolt to a coastline already compromised by the previous event. The city did not sink all at once. It sank by degrees. This is where the geology becomes as important as the archaeology, and also where the complications begin. The seismic events responsible for Pavlopetri's submergence were driven by crustal subsidence, the land itself dropping along fault lines rather than the sea rising to claim it. But identifying the specific faults involved has proved difficult. The fault structures beneath the southern Laconian shelf remain incompletely mapped, and the precise geometry of the coseismic movements that drop the coastline is inferred rather than directly observed. Geomorphological work has identified beach rock markers, ancient shorelines now underwater, that record incremental drops of roughly 1 to 2 meters at different periods, leaving a kind of geological staircase of former sea levels. Each step represents a moment when the land fell and the water followed. But the exact timing of each step, and how cleanly it can be connected to a specific earthquake event, is not fully resolved. The chronologies suggested by marine geology, and those derived from archaeological dating of building foundations, overlap in encouraging ways but do not always align precisely enough to produce a single, agreed sequence. The tectonic contribution to submergence accounts for most of the 4 to 5 meters that now separates Pavlopetri's streets from the modern sea surface. Studies of subsidence rates in the region suggest the land has been dropping at roughly 0.8 to 1 meter per 1,000 years through a combination of continuous crustal flexure and episodic seismic events, a rate that, extended over 5 millennia, produces the kind of offset that archaeology now measures in the water column above the town's foundations. But subsidence alone does not explain everything. Sea level itself has also risen since the Bronze Age, with eustatic change, the actual increase in ocean volume as climate change following the end of the last ice age, contributing an estimated 0.5 meter to 1 meter on top of the tectonic component. These two forces, crustal sinking and sea level rise, have been operating simultaneously and are not always easy to disentangle from each other in the sedimentary and stratigraphic record. What this means in practice is that Pavlopetri's submergence was almost certainly not a catastrophe in the Hollywood sense, not a single night of disaster after which survivors walked away from a city that had vanished beneath the waves by morning. The more likely picture is one of progressive inundation across generations, possibly centuries. A major earthquake lowers parts of the settlement close to the waterline. Flooding during storms becomes more frequent. The harbour, already functional at a higher elevation, finds itself operating with less and less freeboard. Another earthquake drops the ground further. The sea, incrementally higher than it was before, reaches streets that were once comfortably above it. At some point, the combination of damaged structures, recurring flood exposure, and the practical impossibility of sustaining a working port on land that keeps dropping below sea level makes the settlement unviable. People leave, not in panic, but in the slow, difficult recognition that the ground beneath them is no longer trustworthy. This staged model is compelling, but it should be held with appropriate caution because the evidence for it is not uniform. The beach rock stratigraphy that records incremental subsidence events is subject to interpretive uncertainty. Different beach rock series yield sea level reconstructions that can vary by 1/4 meter or more in either direction, and the rate of tectonic subsidence inferred from on-site measurements comes from a limited data set. No consensus exists on whether 3 or 4 distinct earthquakes caused the observed submergence, and some researchers remain open to the possibility that continuous crustal flexure, operating steadily rather than in discrete lurches, combined with occasional large events to produce the total offset. The question is genuinely unsettled, and any version of the story that presents a definitive sequence should be treated with skepticism. What makes Pavlopetri particularly valuable in this debate is that it offers something most submerged sites cannot: a settlement whose construction period can be independently dated, whose building foundations were laid at specific elevations above the then existing sea level, and whose spatial extent and urban form are now well enough documented to serve as anchor points for reconstructing what has changed. When geologists model the site's submergence history, they can check their sea level curves against the archaeological evidence of where walls were built and when. When archaeologists interpret the site's abandonment, they can draw on geological data about fault activity and subsidence rates to inform the timing. Neither discipline can resolve the question alone. This is an investigation that requires both, and Pavlopetri is the rare submerged site complex enough and well documented enough to actually support that kind of integrated analysis. What has emerged from that combination so far is a picture of a place that was not swept away but worn down, a coastal community that functioned brilliantly as long as the land held, then lost that function as the ground itself became unreliable. The architecture that remains, the harbour wall still standing, the street grid still legible. These are the traces of a city that was abandoned rather than destroyed in a moment, left in place as the water rose around it over time rather than swallowed in a single event. The stones were not scattered by catastrophe. They are simply where they were laid, beneath water that arrived, by most accounts, gradually and in stages, which is both a less dramatic story than the myths tend to suggest, and in some ways a more unsettling one. That picture of gradual geological abandonment, a city worn down rather than swallowed whole, creates a particular kind of silence. Pavlopetri left no farewell. No inscription records its final years. No ancient historian marks the moment when its harbour stopped receiving ships. The settlement simply ceased, and the water rose around what remained, and for 3,000 years no written record acknowledged that it had ever existed at all. That silence is real and significant. It is also, predictably, the space into which myth tends to flow. The comparison to Atlantis is almost unavoidable in popular coverage of Pavlopetri, and it is worth taking seriously as a cultural phenomenon, even while treating it carefully as an explanation. National Geographic's documentary series on submerged sites grouped Pavlopetri alongside other drowned places under the umbrella of Legends of Atlantis, and headlines in mainstream outlets have described the site as a real-life Atlantis, often enough that the association has become reflexive. It is easy to understand why. A sophisticated Bronze Age settlement, swallowed by the sea, unknown to history, recovered by modern science in shallow water just offshore. The template fits the myth well enough that the parallel seems to write itself. But the parallel is a matter of narrative resonance, not evidence, and archaeologists working at Pavlopetri are clear on that distinction. The Atlantis account, as Plato recorded it in the 4th century BCE, was almost certainly a philosophical and rhetorical device, a story constructed to make a point about hubris and political order, drawing perhaps on fragmented cultural memories of Aegean catastrophe, but not on any specific documentary source about any specific place. Pavlopetri's submergence is explained by fault lines, subsidence rates, and sea level curves. Atlantis explains nothing about Pavlopetri, and Pavlopetri confirms nothing about Atlantis. What the comparison does illuminate, and usefully, is the broader human experience of losing coastal cities to the sea. Pavlopetri is not singular in that experience. It belongs to a pattern that stretches across the entire Mediterranean and beyond, a pattern driven by the same tectonic and climatic forces that shaped its own fate. Helike, a Greek city on the Gulf of Corinth, was destroyed by earthquake and tsunami in 373 BCE, an event documented in ancient writing precisely because it happened within historical memory. Thonis Heracleion, the great Egyptian port at the mouth of the Nile, subsided into the sea as the Nile Delta compacted beneath it, taking with it temples, statues, and centuries of maritime commerce. Caesarea Maritima's harbour structures now sit underwater along the Israeli coast. Portions of ancient Alexandria are submerged in the harbour where Cleopatra's palace once stood. The Mediterranean's active tectonic setting, the African plate pressing against the Eurasian plate, volcanic arcs and fault systems running through Greece, Turkey, Italy and the Levant, has been reshaping coastlines continuously, and human settlements built on those coastlines have paid the price repeatedly across millennia. Pavlopetri is one instance in a long and well-documented pattern of natural processes doing what natural processes do. The difference between Pavlopetri and most of those other cases is the written record, or rather its absence. Helic's fate was recorded because Greek historians were alive to witness and document it. Thonis Heracleion left inscriptions that named it. Alexandria's submerged structures exist within a city whose historical continuity was never broken. Pavlopetri, by contrast, sank before the historical record of the region was established with enough density to catch its disappearance. The linear B-tablets that survive from Mycenaean administrative centres record grain allocations and lists of workers, not chronicles of coastal losses. The site's abandonment fell into the very period, the late Bronze Age collapse and its aftermath, roughly 1200 to 900 BCE. When the record-keeping systems of the Aegean were themselves collapsing. Whatever institutional memory existed of the settlement at the tip of the Laconian coast, it did not survive the disruptions of that era in any recoverable form. The silence around Pavlopetri is not unique to Pavlopetri. It is the silence of an entire age. That absence of written memory does not deepen the mystery in any way that suggests a legendary explanation is needed. It deepens it only in the sense that we have fewer tools available than we would like. The story of Pavlopetri has to be read entirely from its material remains, from the orientation of walls, the depth of foundation courses, the distribution of pottery types across excavated surfaces, the geochemical signatures in sediment cores. These are genuinely informative sources, and the picture they produce is increasingly detailed. But they cannot produce the kind of narrative that written records provide, the texture of individual experience and collective decision-making that lets us understand a place as its inhabitants understood it. That gap is real, and it is what makes the site feel inexplicable at a human level, even when the geological explanation is reasonably well understood. The myth, then, serves a legitimate function in framing public imagination, even when it serves no function as archaeology. The stories cultures tell about drowned cities, whether Atlantis or the Welsh legend of Cantrea Gwaelod, the sunken kingdom beneath Cardigan Bay, or the Tamil tradition of a lost continent beneath the Indian Ocean, reflect a genuine and recurring human experience. Coastlines do change, cities do disappear, the sea is a boundary that moves. These stories encode, at some cultural level, the memory of that instability, even when the specific details are transformed beyond recognition by centuries of retelling. Plato may have drawn, however loosely, on Aegean folk memories of Bronze Age coastal losses, the volcanic destruction of Thera, the earthquake-swallowed harbours of the Peloponnese, when he constructed his philosophical fable. If so, places like Pavlopetri are part of the cultural sediment from which the Atlantis story was made, in the same diffuse way that many specific historical events contribute to general cultural memory, without any one of them being the singular source. But that is a long distance from saying that Pavlopetri is Atlantis, or that the myth explains its fate, or that its submergence is anything other than what the geology and archaeology together indicate. A consequence of living on tectonically unstable ground, in a period when sea levels were rising, in a settlement whose abandonment was driven by accumulated physical losses rather than moral failure or divine punishment. The city went under because plates move and land sinks and the sea follows. The memory gap that surrounds it is a product of historical accident, not supernatural erasure. The myth is a way of acknowledging that something significant was lost, and that the loss was real enough to echo across millennia, even when the specific name and location had been forgotten. Pavlopetri doesn't need the myth to be extraordinary. The fact of its survival, stone walls still standing, streets still aligned, harbour still structurally intact in 3 meters of clear water, is extraordinary enough on its own terms. What transforms a submerged site from a curiosity into something that can actually be understood, analysed and shared is methodology. For decades after Nicholas Fleming's 1967 rediscovery, Pavlopetri was known primarily through hand-drawn plans and limited visual surveys, useful but constrained by the inherent difficulty of working underwater with conventional tools. You could swim the streets and sketch what you saw. You could take measurements between fixed points and gradually accumulate a partial picture. What you could not do, with those methods, was capture the full three-dimensional complexity of a settlement, covering tens of thousands of square meters, with the kind of precision that archaeological interpretation genuinely requires. That changed dramatically between 2009 and 2013, when a new phase of investigation began that would not only transform what we know about Pavlopetri, but establish a benchmark for how underwater archaeology is practiced. The Pavlopetri Underwater Archaeology Project was a 5-year collaboration between the University of Nottingham and the Hellenic Ministry of Culture, supported by technical partners who brought equipment and expertise that simply had not existed in earlier eras of underwater survey. The project's stated aim was to outline the full history and development of the submerged town, not to excavate it in the traditional sense, but to record it at a level of completeness and accuracy that would allow genuine architectural and urban analysis. The tools chosen for that task were unlike anything previously applied to a drowned settlement at this scale. The core of the survey combined sector scan sonar, specifically a Kongsberg Mesotech system capable of generating high-resolution acoustic point clouds, with a robotic total station laser system operating above the water to provide a precise geodetic framework. Below the surface, stereophotogrammetry added another layer of visual and dimensional data, capturing surface textures and spatial relationships with centimetre-level accuracy. These systems worked in concert. The sonar could penetrate the water column and map the topography of the seabed and its structures across wide areas quickly, while the laser and photogrammetric systems provided the millimetre precision detail needed for individual architectural features. The result was not a sketch or a schematic. It was a genuine three-dimensional digital model of a city. Every wall face, every room boundary, every street surface, every visible threshold and courtyard edge recorded in space with a level of fidelity that no previous underwater archaeological project had achieved for an entire settlement. The significance of that achievement was recognized immediately. Pavlopetri became the first submerged town ever to be fully digitally surveyed in 3 dimensions. Not the first underwater site to be mapped, not the first to use sonar, but the first where an entire settlement, streets, buildings, open spaces, harbour installations, was captured as a coherent, complete, 3-dimensional record. That distinction matters because it changed what questions could be asked of the evidence. In a hand-drawn plan, ambiguities accumulate. Walls that might be parallel or might slightly converge look the same at the scale of a sketched line. Rooms that might be separate buildings or might share a party wall require physical examination to distinguish. A 3-dimensional model at centimetre resolution resolves those ambiguities, or at least makes them explicit and measurable rather than invisible. The scale of what the survey captured was substantial. The previously known extent of the site, the area that Fleming and subsequent investigators had identified and partially recorded, amounted to approximately 30,000 square metres of structures. That alone would make Pavlopetri a significant Bronze Age settlement. But the 2009 to 2013 survey didn't just record what was already known, it discovered more. As the sonar data was processed and the 3-dimensional model assembled, approximately 9,000 additional square metres of buildings and streets emerged from the acoustic record, features that earlier surveys had either missed entirely or had not been able to resolve clearly enough to identify as architecture. The known footprint of the settlement expanded toward nearly 4 hectares of mapped structures, and that figure itself may be conservative. More recent modelling has suggested the full extent of remains could be considerably larger still, potentially exceeding 8 hectares, though that wider estimate remains a subject of ongoing investigation rather than settled conclusion. Among the most striking of the new discoveries was a large rectangular hall approximately 40 metres in length. To put that in context, 40 metres is not a domestic building. In the architectural vocabulary of the Bronze Age Aegean, a hall at that scale suggests civic or ceremonial function, something comparable in purpose, if not in precise form, to the great megaron halls found at Mycenaean palace centres like Tiryns and Pylos. Its discovery beneath water that had been surveyed before, using less capable instruments, is a reminder of how much detail earlier methods left invisible. The hall had been there all along, its stone foundations lying in a few metres of water, its outline recoverable only when the right combination of technology and systematic coverage was finally applied. That systematic completeness is one of the things that makes the three-dimensional model genuinely transformative, rather than merely impressive as a technical demonstration. Earlier partial surveys of Pavlopetri had produced interpretations, reasonable ones given the data available, about the layout of the settlement, the relationship between neighbourhoods, the function of particular structures. The full three-dimensional record allowed those interpretations to be tested against a much richer body of evidence, and in several cases it changed the picture. The spatial relationships between buildings that had appeared disconnected in earlier plans turned out to be part of connected complexes. Street alignments that seemed ambiguous became clear. The overall urban organisation of the settlement, the logic of how a Bronze Age port town arranged itself across available ground, became legible in a way it had not been before. Then the team did something that extended the project's impact far beyond the academic community. The three-dimensional data was processed into photorealistic visualizations, reconstructions that showed the settlement not as a scatter of stone foundations on a seabed, but as it might have appeared to a visitor arriving by ship 4,000 years ago. Those visualizations were made available online through a virtual reconstruction platform, allowing anyone with an internet connection to navigate a model of a Bronze Age city that existed millennia before the historical period that most people associate with ancient Greece. Scholars could examine building orientations and propose functional interpretations. Students could walk virtual streets. The general public could encounter a place they had never heard of and understand immediately, viscerally, that it had been a real city, organised, planned, inhabited by people who traded across the Aegean and maintained a harbour complex that the sea preserved in structural form for 3,000 years. That accessibility matters for reasons that go beyond public education, important as that is. A site that only specialists can engage with is a site whose protection depends entirely on institutional will. A site that anyone can explore and understand is a site with a constituency. A public that can respond when threats emerge, that can support preservation campaigns, that can push for the legal and physical protections the place requires. What the 2009 to 2013 project built, alongside its digital model of a drowned city, was a foundation for precisely that kind of broader engagement. The three-dimensional map of Pavlopetri is not just a research tool, it is an argument for why the place deserves to survive. The three-dimensional map produced by the 2009 to 2013 project answered critical questions about the layout and extent of Pavlopetri. But a different kind of question had been building alongside the archaeological work for years, one that digital survey alone could not fully resolve. How exactly did this city go under? What forces had shaped the way its remains survived? And what was actively happening to the site right now beneath the surface, with every tide and storm that passed over it? Those questions required a different kind of modelling, not archaeological reconstruction, but oceanographic science applied to a drowned landscape. The answer came in 2022 with the publication of a study by researchers, including Seraphim Paulos and colleagues, who applied nearshore hydrodynamic modelling to Pavlopetri in what amounted to the most rigorous physical analysis the site had ever received. The work brought together radiocarbon dating, regional sea level curves, and computational simulations of water movement, sediment transport, and coastal processes to construct a dynamic picture of what had been happening to the site from its occupation through to the present. The results were illuminating in ways that went well beyond confirming what archaeologists had already suspected. Start with the submergence itself. For decades, the dominant hypothesis was essentially seismic. The city sank because earthquakes dropped the coastal land surface, and the sea followed. The first major inundation event was broadly placed around 1000 BCE, roughly coinciding with the end of the Bronze Age and the broader collapse that dismantled Mycenaean civilization across the Aegean. That picture was never entirely satisfying, partly because earthquakes alone seemed like an incomplete explanation for a process that apparently unfolded in stages rather than in a single catastrophic moment. The 2022 model addressed this directly. By integrating the tectonic record with sea level reconstructions, it showed that the site's submergence was almost certainly the product of multiple converging processes working across different timescales, seismic subsidence providing sudden steps downward, combined with the gradual but relentless creep of sea level rise that has added 4 to 5 meters over the 5,000 years since the city's earliest occupation. During its Bronze Age peak, the settlement had sat roughly 2 to 3 meters above sea level. The same ground lies 4 meters below present sea level today. Neither earthquakes alone nor sea level rise alone produces that full picture. The new model provided a framework in which both could be understood as components of a longer process, with coastal erosion adding a third dimension that earlier interpretations had underweighted. That combination, tectonic, eustatic, and erosional, now looks like the most complete explanation available. The researchers are careful to note that the precise timing of each seismic episode remains contested, and the microscale dynamics of exactly when each part of the settlement went under are not yet resolved. What the model contributed beyond submergence history was an analysis of what has been happening to the site since it sank. This is where the findings become particularly consequential for anyone thinking about Pavlopetri's future. The hydrodynamic simulations showed that prevailing currents and wave action have been working on the stone-lined harbour continuously since at least the Hellenistic period, eroding foundations, shifting stones, and gradually degrading the structural integrity of the very features that make the site extraordinary. The quantification was striking. A low-profile submerged breakwater placed in water deeper than 5 meters could theoretically reduce those erosive forces by as much as 80%. That is not an abstract finding. It is an engineering specification with direct implications for how protection could be designed and deployed. The sediment dynamics revealed by the model are equally important, and they help explain something that divers and archaeologists had observed without fully understanding. Pavlopetri's remains are not simply lying on a stable seabed. The movement of fine-grained sediment from the adjacent shore creates a situation where structural elements are periodically buried under drifting deposits, which actually provides a form of protection, and then re-exposed when storm energy is high enough to resuspend that material. The problem is that resuspension events don't just uncover walls, they destabilize them. Stones that had been held in position by sediment pressure on multiple sides are suddenly left unsupported on one face, making them vulnerable to displacement by the next current pulse. This cycle of burial and exposure, driven by ordinary coastal processes, explains the sediment-shifting damage that divers have been documenting for years without a clear physical mechanism to account for it. The model provided that mechanism, which means it also pointed toward potential interventions, not just for Pavlopetri but as a conceptual tool applicable to other submerged sites facing similar conditions. Perhaps the most significant contribution of the 2022 work is methodological, rather than site-specific. By applying systematic hydrodynamic modelling to a well-documented archaeological site, the study demonstrated that assumptions built into old narratives about site formation and preservation can be tested quantitatively rather than simply debated interpretively. The earthquake hypothesis for Pavlopetri's submergence was not wrong. It captured a real component of what happened, but it was incomplete in ways that archaeology alone could not fully reveal, because the missing pieces were fundamentally questions of physics, how water moves, how sediment responds to wave energy, how coastal land behaves under combined tectonic and eustatic stress over millennia. Those are questions that oceanographic science is equipped to answer, and the 2022 model showed what becomes possible when that toolkit is pointed at an ancient site rather than a modern coastline. The practical conservation implications are concrete. and have been incorporated into the site management planning that continues around Pavlopetri. The breakwater proposal addresses the erosive current problem. A program of continuous environmental monitoring, tracking temperature, salinity, and biological activity at the site would allow managers to detect changes in material deterioration before they become irreversible, restricting anchoring specifically in zones where the model identified high sediment mobility would remove one of the most damaging sources of mechanical disturbance. Each of these recommendations flows directly from the physical understanding the model produced, which means the conservation strategy is grounded in actual site dynamics, rather than general best practice guidelines applied without site-specific knowledge. What the new models did not change is worth acknowledging honestly. The precise current speeds and sediment fluxes at the microscale, the level of detail that would allow predictions about individual walls and specific features, remain poorly constrained. The exact sequence of seismic events that contributed to submergence is still debated. There are historical questions about Pavlopetri, about who lived there in its final decades, about what the inhabitants understood as the sea crept closer, that no amount of oceanographic modelling will ever answer. Better physical science sharpens the framework without filling every gap. The city still holds its silences, and some of them will remain intact regardless of how sophisticated the tools brought to bear on the problem become. What the models changed was the quality of the questions that can now be asked, and the confidence with which certain answers can be rejected as insufficient. That is not a small thing. It is precisely how understanding slowly and imperfectly moves forward. The physical models made the threats visible in a new way, but making threats visible and actually stopping them are two different problems, and the gap between those two things is where Pavlopetri now sits, in a condition that conservationists describe with a particular kind of controlled urgency. Not panic, but something close to it. The site's most immediate dangers are not dramatic. They are mundane, which in some ways makes them harder to address. Commercial vessels and recreational boats passing through the bay off Laconia routinely drop anchor, and an anchor chain dragging across a Bronze Age street does not announce itself as a catastrophe. It just moves stones. A hull cleaned illegally above the ruins releases biocides directly into the water column, introducing chemical contamination to a site that survived 5,000 years of natural processes only to meet anti-fouling paint. Ballast water discharged in the vicinity brings invasive species, organisms that have no natural history with this particular stretch of seabed, and no biological relationship with the materials they now colonize. Small boat traffic that seems entirely harmless from the surface stirs up fine-grained sediment every time a propeller turns, and as the 2022 oceanographic model showed in detail, that sediment disturbance is not a neutral event. It destabilizes foundations. It exposes stones that had been protected by burial. It accelerates the same erosion cycle that currents and wave energy had already been running for centuries. Add to this the industrial pressure from nearby development, pipeline projects, power infrastructure, that brings pollution to a coastal zone already under stress, and then factor in a projected sea level rise of somewhere between 30 centimetres and half a metre over the coming century, and the picture that emerges is of a site being eroded from multiple directions simultaneously by forces operating at different speeds and at different scales, most of them invisible to anyone standing on a boat looking down through clear water. That clarity is one of Pavlopetri's central ironies, the 3 to 4 metre depth that makes the streets visible to a snorkeling tourist, that allowed the 2009 to 2013 team to conduct high-resolution photogrammetry without deep-water equipment, that makes the stone-lined harbour more accessible to archaeologists than almost any comparable Bronze Age site in the world. That same depth is precisely what makes the site so vulnerable. Shallow water is energetic water. It is where wave action is strongest, where boat traffic is densest, where anchor damage is most frequent, and where a curious visitor who has read about a drowned city and wants to see it for themselves can reach down and, with entirely good intentions, displace a stone that has not moved in 3,000 years. Visibility invites attention, and attention without management invites damage. The depth that has made Pavlopetri famous is also the depth that is slowly taking it apart. The international response to these threats has been real, if uneven. Pavlopetri is covered by the 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, which provides a legal framework for safeguarding submerged sites within the waters of signatory states. In 2016, the site was listed on the World Monuments Watch, a program run by the World Monuments Fund that identifies endangered cultural sites around the world and directs funding, expertise, and public attention toward them. The watch listing did not come with unlimited resources, but it came with something nearly as valuable: legitimacy and visibility at an international level, making it harder for the threats to Pavlopetri to be treated as a local administrative inconvenience, and easier to make the case that this was a site of global significance requiring active stewardship. Annual World Monument Watch Days, held since 2016, bring specialist tours, public events, and educational programming to the site, building a constituency of people who understand what is at risk and why. On the ground, or rather in the water, the practical measures reflect both what is possible and the persistent gap between what is needed and what has been achieved. Greek authorities, working alongside organisations including the Alliance for the Restoration of Cultural Heritage, have installed underwater signage and waterproof maps that orient divers to the site and communicate its significance. Guided snorkeling tours have been organised, offering a form of supervised access that channels interest productively, rather than simply hoping curious visitors will cause no harm. A management plan developed around 2018 and 2019 called for special port regulations and marine protected area status, designations that would give enforcement officers legal tools to act against anchoring and illegal hull cleaning, rather than simply requesting compliance. Whether that status has been fully secured, and whether enforcement resources have materialised to make it meaningful in practice, remains an open question. The buoy network tells a small story that captures the larger difficulty. 8 buoys were deployed around the ruins to mark the exclusion zone and keep vessels clear. It was a reasonable and relatively low-cost intervention, visible, practical, and directly targeted at one of the most damaging threats. Then several of the buoys were lost or stolen. The fact that this happened is not a minor administrative footnote. It illustrates something fundamental about the challenge of protecting a shallow-water archaeological site in a working coastal environment. The measures that are simple enough to implement quickly are also simple enough to circumvent or remove, and the site has no capacity to defend itself. Stone walls do not call for help when an anchor chain drags across them. Technology has added a layer of monitoring that did not exist a decade ago. Volunteers now use a mobile application that logs real-time ship positions and publishes alerts on a public platform. When vessels appear to be anchoring or operating within the protected zone, it functions as a digital watch, supplementing the physical buoy barrier with a kind of distributed human attention that is harder to defeat than a mooring that can be cut loose. Whether alerts translate reliably into intervention depends on enforcement capacity that the monitoring system itself cannot provide. But the awareness it creates has its own value. A vessel operator who knows that their position is being logged and published, that someone ashore is watching and can name the ship, is operating in a different environment than one who believes no one is paying attention. None of these measures, the UNESCO framework, the watch listing, the guided tours, the buoys, the digital monitoring, is sufficient on its own. Each addresses a fraction of the problem. Together they constitute something more like a holding action than a solution, a set of interventions designed to slow the damage while the harder institutional and financial questions about long-term management are worked out. The 2022 hydrodynamic model pointed toward a submerged breakwater as a technically feasible way to reduce erosive current energy by a significant margin. Designing and funding that structure remains a project for the future. Formalizing marine protected area status and funding the enforcement capacity to make it real remains a project for the future. Pavlopetri's past has now been mapped in more detail than almost any comparable Bronze Age settlement anywhere in the world. Its future depends entirely on decisions being made in the present, by institutions and individuals who have to be convinced, repeatedly and with evidence, that what lies beneath that clear shallow water is worth the sustained effort of protecting. Discovery in the end is the easy part. What does it actually mean that Pavlopetri exists? Not that it was found, not that it was mapped, not that it is now threatened, but that it exists at all, in the form that it does, in a state of preservation that allows the question to be asked with this kind of specificity. Start with what the site contains, because the list is still remarkable even after everything that has been said about it. Stone streets, 2-story houses arranged in a recognizable grid, courtyards, public buildings, including a hall 40 meters long that had no parallel in the known record until the 2009 survey revealed it beneath the sediment, a water management system, hundreds of large storage vessels, pithoi, still in place, vessels that once held olive oil and wine and grain moving through a port economy that connected southern Laconia to Minoan Crete and to trading partners across the Aegean world, and surrounding all of it, a harbour. Not the ghost of a harbour, not a coastline feature that archaeologists have interpreted as harbour adjacent, but a stone-lined structure built deliberately to receive ships, protected by the natural geometry of a sandy bay, still standing, still structurally intact. After 5,000 years beneath the sea, the infrastructure built to move Bronze Age goods from ship to shore has outlasted almost everything built on the surface of the land in the same period. That is not an accident of preservation, it is evidence of engineering. The people who built Pavlopetri understood their environment in a way that produced durable results, and the harbour is the most concentrated expression of that understanding. Intact maritime infrastructure at this age is essentially unique in the archaeological record. Other Bronze Age sites have yielded pottery, tablets, palace foundations, even cargo still in the holds of sunken ships. What almost none of them have yielded is the port itself, the physical arrangement that made maritime trade possible on a daily operational basis. Pavlopetri has that. It is the difference between finding evidence that people sailed and finding the place where they launched. That distinction reshapes what we can say about Bronze Age seafaring societies with confidence rather than inference. For a long time, the mental model of early Aegean civilization was organized around palatial power. The palace at Knossos, the palace at Mycenae, the redistributive economy flowing outward from centralized elites. That model is not wrong, but it is incomplete, and Pavlopetri reveals what the gaps contained. Here was a functioning port town that predates the great Mycenaean palaces by well over a millennium in its earliest occupation phases, a settlement where urban planning was already sophisticated, where long-distance trade was already institutionalized, where the architecture of commerce had already been solved well enough to build it in stone. The town plan at Pavlopetri does not look like a temporary settlement or a seasonal anchorage. It looks like a place where people lived with intention, organised their space deliberately, and built for permanence. That is not the picture of a pre-palatial Aegean that the textbooks carried for most of the 20th century. There is a specific assumption that Pavlopetri puts under pressure, and it is worth naming directly. The assumption that complexity, organised towns, planned infrastructure, sustained trade networks, is something that developed late and spread from a few centres outward. What the site suggests instead is that coastal communities in the Bronze Age Aegean had already worked out many of the practical problems of urban life long before the civilization that most people know about rose to dominate the record. The streets beneath the water did not need the palaces of Mycenae to tell them how to be streets. This has implications that extend beyond academic debates about periodization. It changes the public understanding of what prehistoric port communities could be. The word prehistoric carries a conceptual weight that Pavlopetri continually resists. It implies something unformed, something on the way to becoming sophisticated rather than already there. But a settlement with planned streets, 2-story architecture, managed water supply, and a purpose-built harbour linked to international trade networks is not a precursor to civilization in any meaningful sense. It is civilization, operating in the Bronze Age Mediterranean at a scale and with a degree of organization that should have been obvious in hindsight, but that required a drowned city to prove. And then there are the things that Pavlopetri does not resolve, which matter as much as the things it does. The precise span of its occupation is still contested, whether the primary period of activity belongs to the earlier phases reaching back toward 3500 BCE, or whether the Mycenaean period between 1600 and 1100 BCE represents its peak, or whether both are true in ways that reflect different kinds of urban life in the same location across millennia. The mechanism of submergence is still debated, whether the city went under in a single seismic catastrophe, or through a slower combination of tectonic subsidence and the long creep of sea level rise that has lifted the Mediterranean by 4 to 5 meters since the Bronze Age. The full extent of the settlement is still uncertain, with estimates ranging across a factor of 4 depending on which survey data you weight. These are not gaps that embarrass the research. They are the shape of what a genuinely complex site looks like when honest scholarship engages with it. The unresolved questions are not a weakness in the record. They are an invitation, a sign that the site still has more to give than it has already surrendered. That is part of what Pavlopetri changes in the larger conversation about the past. It demonstrates that the archaeological record of the Bronze Age Aegean is not complete, not even close to complete, and that the coastlines and shallow seas that Bronze Age people actually lived alongside and worked from have barely been examined by comparison to the land sites that dominate the discipline. How many ports are out there? How many harbour towns, trading settlements, coastal communities that organise the actual movement of goods across the ancient Mediterranean lie in 3 or 4 meters of clear water, their stone streets visible to anyone willing to look? The answer is almost certainly more than we know. Pavlopetri is not an anomaly, it is probably a sample, which means that the work of finding, mapping, understanding and protecting these places is a project that has barely begun. Discovery was only the first step. It is always only the first step, and a city still waiting offshore is proof of both how much has been found and how much remains. So come back to the water, stand on the shore at Vatica Bay and look out. The sea here is clear enough that you do not need to imagine what lies beneath it. 3 to 4 meters down, the stones are visible. Streets run in the directions they were laid 5,000 years ago. Walls stand at the heights the original builders left them. The harbour structure, stone-lined, deliberate, engineered to receive ships, sits where it was constructed, intact in a way that almost nothing built on land in the same era has managed to remain. The city is right there. It has always been right there, within sight of shore, within swimming distance, visible in the right light from above the surface, a complete Bronze Age port town, resting in the shallows, waiting. This video has assembled a case, piece by piece, and it is worth holding all of it together now. Pavlopetri is not a ruin in the conventional sense, not a collapsed structure or an eroded outline. It is a preserved urban environment occupied from as early as 3500 BCE and continuously inhabited through the Mycenaean period until sometime after 1000 BCE, when a combination of tectonic earthquakes and a sea level rise of 4 to 5 meters gradually consumed the town. It was a working port linked to Minoan Crete, to the Cyclades, to the wider Aegean trade world, its economy visible in the pithoi still standing in their storage positions, and in the imported ceramics that archaeologists have pulled from the sediment. It had streets arranged in a recognizable grid, houses built to 2 stories, courtyards, a water management system, a 40-meter hall that had no known parallel in the Bronze Age record until the 2009 survey found it beneath the sea floor. Between 2009 and 2014, a team using sector scan sonar, robotic total stations, and photogrammetry produced the first complete 3-dimensional map of a submerged town, approximately 30,000 square meters of known structures, plus another 9,000 square metres of buildings, streets and features that no one had documented before. The map changed what scholars knew about early urban planning, about Aegean trade networks, about what a coastal Bronze Age community actually looked like in practice. That is the summary. And it is extraordinary. But the most important thing this video has tried to hold honestly alongside all of that is the thing that the map cannot answer. We can describe Pavlopetri in extraordinary detail. We can walk its streets virtually, measure its harbour walls, trace the routes its goods travelled, model the acoustics of its public buildings, calculate the approximate capacity of its storage vessels. What we cannot do, what the archaeology has not yet resolved and may never fully resolve, is explain with certainty exactly how it disappeared. The earthquakes beginning around 1000 BCE, the slow climb of sea level, the tectonic subsidence of the southern Laconian coast. These are the mechanisms that scholars have identified, but the precise sequence, the timing, whether the city emptied in crisis or declined gradually, whether its people watched it go under, or whether they were already gone, that story has not come back up with the artefacts. The harbour stones are intact. The memory of how they were lost is not. That is not a failure of research. It is the honest shape of what the site contains and what it withholds. And in some ways, that gap, that preserved city without a recoverable ending, is what makes Pavlopetri so difficult to turn away from. We know what was built. We do not fully know what was lost, or how, or when. The absence at the centre of the story makes the presence of the stones more charged, not less. Which is why what happens next matters as much as everything that came before. Pavlopetri is under threat right now. Not from the Bronze Age sea level rise that swallowed it, but from anchors dragged across its streets by recreational boats, from sediment disturbed by hull-cleaning chemicals that have no business being in those waters, from industrial development on the nearby shore, from the accelerating sea level rise that climate change is adding to a process that already claimed the city once. The harbour that survived 5 millennia of submergence is being eroded by visitors who do not know or do not care what they are anchoring into. UNESCO designation, World Monuments, Fund Watch status, a management plan developed in 2018 and 2019. These exist. What has lagged is implementation. The buoy nets, the signage, the visitor infrastructure that would allow people to experience the site without destroying it. These things are still in progress. The final chapter of Pavlopetri's story is being written now by decisions made about funding and enforcement and political will, and it is the only chapter in which the outcome is still genuinely open. A city that sank 5,000 years ago and somehow kept its harbour walls standing deserves better than to be finished off by anchor chains. What Phocion Negris glimpsed in 1904, what Nicholas Fleming mapped in 1967, what a team of underwater archaeologists spent years digitally reconstructing in 3 dimensions. All of that knowledge, all of that recovered history, depends for its survival on the physical site remaining intact enough to keep yielding answers. Pavlopetri is both an achievement and a fragile survivor. It is the oldest submerged town ever systematically mapped, and it is still, in the same breath, one anchor, drop away from irreversible damage. The streets are still there. The harbour stones are still standing. The city is still waiting offshore. Whether it will still be there for the next generation of researchers to ask better questions of, that part is up to us.